Good afternoon. Mogesalmabit, Barevzes, Dobry Den. 30 years have passed since the countries of Eastern Partnership have regained their independence. Yet, as the Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich often puts it, freedom did not turn out to be an instantaneous holiday that we all dreamed about. As we have learned by now, freedom is a long and bumpy road where path markers are often missing and we don't know where to go, but we're certainly in for this ride. Young democracies of Eastern Partnership, and today we will be especially focusing on Armenia, Georgia, and Ukraine, have indeed come far over the last 3 decades. However, the trajectory of development has been anything but certain. Illiberal trends, Russian influence on the civic agenda, and threats against human rights defenders are on the rise. What's next for Europe's young democracies? Today, we will try to look ahead from the civil society perspective. We have an amazing panel from the network of human rights houses and our partner organizations. The panel will be moderated by Natalia Antelava, journalist, editor-in-chief of Koda Story, media that focuses on authoritarian tech and disinformation. Natalia has covered wars in Ukraine, in Georgia, and she has unearthed human rights abuses in Central Asia. Before the panel, we will hear from our distinguished guests, former ombudsman of Poland and the Dean of Law Faculty at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw, Professor Adam Bodnar. Now, the webinar is in English. We will have simultaneous Russian interpretation. We're live on Zoom and on Facebook. You can ask questions to Professor Bodnar and later to our panelists via Zoom Q&A function or via Facebook. Dear Adam, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Kety, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this important webinar taking place at the 30th anniversary of those key crucial changes in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you very much to the Human Rights House Foundation for hosting me here. And I was asked to share some of my views, thoughts about where are we now and what is our future. And let me just share some of my experiences. I come from so my last 6 years were as the Ombudsman of Poland, but before I was working for more than 10 years for the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights in Warsaw, and I had a privilege to cooperate with a number of organizations in the region. So I would like to say and to start with that I come from a country which suffers a lot from a democracy crisis, and being the ombudsman for the last 6 years was a really difficult challenge. At the same time, it was a lesson how the rule of law and democracy could be easily dismantled and what could be the role of independent guardian as well as the role of non-government organizations. And it was a painful lesson of mistakes also made during the last 25 years of transformation in Poland, especially between 1989 and 2015. I think that it is important to underline that I come from a generation which still remembers communist times. My family, fortunately, did not suffer at that time, but I remember well the move from the authoritarian country towards democracy and towards human rights protection. I also remember the move from centrally planned economy to the market economy, and I remember empty shelves, and now I cannot even decide what kind of Lego to buy for my kid. And it is obvious to say that the world in 2022 is completely different as it was in 1992, 30 years ago. Major geopolitical shifts, Russia interference, new technologies, pandemic, all of this affects us and affected us. Nevertheless, certain values are still the same, although they are sometimes put under question. And the paradigm of human rights protection did not change. The protection of human rights is still the cornerstone and basic value for our societies. Human rights were not replaced with any form of group rights, with any form of communitarism. And we know well that without rule of law, our countries will be subject to corruption, cronyism, and the failure of democracy. We are all here human rights defenders. In our daily work, we are fighting for values. We want the world and our countries to be a better place. We know that morality is with us, but that is why sometimes we tend to think that the world should be organized according to our expectations. However, and I think that is the major problem, the world and politics are much more complicated and genes than we think. We do not have such a huge impact on economic reforms, on military, on the relationship with other countries, on imperial ambitions of certain leaders. But it should not make us unhappy. It should make us to rethink what is in fact our role in societies. And in my opinion, our role is first, to be guardians of constitutional rights and freedoms, to protect and fight for rights of victims of human rights violations using different methods such as monitoring, advocacy, strategic litigation, and also taking into account special situation of vulnerable groups and minorities. Our role is to promote international human rights norms and their embeddedness in a society and in state institutions. Our role is also to support international cooperation and supranational mechanisms of human rights protection. Our role is also to support state institutions responsible for human rights protections, as well as to inspire political parties and movements shaping state policies to mainstream human rights into their agendas. And let me give just one example. The ruling party in Poland introduced in 2015 the social benefits supporting families named 500 plus, which means 500 zlotys per each kid. Thanks to this benefit, the life of many families got better and the society became much more egalitarian. It was a decision of politicians and voters to introduce that kind of a measure. It was a political project that changed reality. But it was introduced mostly without any influence of human rights defenders. Why? Because it was not our role to suggest good ideas to manage the country. It is the role of politicians, maybe think tanks. And there are many areas of the state operation where we do not have, and maybe we should not even have, competence, people, resources to inspire politicians, because our role in a society is different. The same with different military issues. Shall we decide on purchase of weapons, on military training, on unions with other countries? No, it is not our role. If we look at it from this perspective, we will actually find that our states in democracies are in crisis. But I would like to stress, we should not take on too much responsibility, guided by our innate empathy and sensitivity to the evils of the world. Rather, let us think ourselves whether over the years we have done everything possible, everything within our powers to serve the values we hold dear. Other things may not be within our control. From this perspective, we should read the last 30 years positively. First, there is now a whole range of non-governmental organizations in every country that work to protect human rights. Generations of activists are being born and are active in this field. At moments of political breakthroughs, their experiences are helpful to politicians. Second, on more than one occasion, the activities of human rights NGOs have set limits to the actions of the authorities. Sometimes I joke that our role is reduced to cleaning up the snow that keeps falling from the sky. If we're not there, the access roads would be covered. Yet many times they are not. People are hoping for justice, for rights to be asserted in national and international courts. People see that sometimes, even in difficult cases, you can win and get compensation. Just look at the many judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Third, in all this time, we have learned methods for human rights protection. Where did we learn about monitoring or strategic litigation a long time ago? After all, we did not have such organizations as the American Civil Liberties Union, which had been active in the United States for decades. We did not have a tradition of the rule of law and respect for the courts. It was a process of learning of basic civic virtues for all of us. I must admit that we have made many mistakes. For example, we did not invest enough time and energy into convincing politicians that civic education is key to the development. When politicians attack courts, they have much easier tasks when people do not understand that courts should serve them. Second, some of us decided to join the world of politics, and they have suddenly forgotten about values that we served for a long time. They have betrayed our values, in fact. I don't claim that there should be no move to politics from the position of human rights defenders, but you should at least try to continue your mission as much as you can, because otherwise you bring damage to the whole movement of human rights defenders. Third, we did not appreciate the role of social media. We started to use them in our work, we still do, but in the same social media, human rights are under constant pressure and some negative values are promoted. Moreover, politicians make use of social media in order to promote their populistic and nationalistic thinking, undermining human rights. Fourth, we did not protect independent media as much as we could. Being human rights defenders, we concentrate on cases, but not so much on the general landscape of media pluralism. In fact, it is media pluralism that is crucial in the democratic process and also proper accountability of politicians for their work. Fifth, we tend to concentrate on issues that are attractive to populations of big cities, that are intellectually attractive and progressive. If the police beats someone in a small city, there is nothing new in such a case. It is just one of many, many cases of similar nature. If the access to hospital is restricted to someone living in a rural area, you do not have to invent a new right. You have just to claim the right that exists. If a person of disability cannot get on the bus to go to work or to school, it is just a case about respecting UN Convention on Rights of Disabilities, on rights of persons with disabilities. All those people need our help. We have to be present locally in order to help them. Fighting for social justice, wherever you live, whether in rural areas or in bigger cities, brings social legitimacy to the human rights movement. And that was the reason I have traveled across Poland throughout my mission as the Ombudsman. Altogether, I have visited and had meetings with more than 200 Polish cities. But thanks to this, people respected my work and they had a feeling that I am close to them in their daily problems. Finally, I would like to admit one more mistake. In 2013-14, more or less 8-9 years ago, I thought that NGOs should transfer itself into more and more professional organizations with staff, proper funding, stability, etc. Certainly, such organizations are important. They should be anchors for the civil society. But at the same time, we should invest our time and energy into supporting different actions at the grassroots level. Not the volume of funding is important, but the volume of people engaged into active citizenship, using their political rights, both at local and central level. Emergence of so-called street opposition in Poland is one of the greatest achievements in last years. The same with the women's strike, the massive organization present in whole Poland and fighting for access to reproductive rights. Such initiatives are changing our discourse. Authoritarian rulers are scared of them as they constitute a people's voice based on emotions, and politicians have to deal not only with voice of NGOs that sometimes go too much into technocratic methods, but we have to be there in order to support street and non-violent movements with our knowledge and by defending leaders against reprisals. Please note that now, thanks to new technologies, we have even more possibilities than ever to shape public awareness on human rights, to make intensive crowdfunding, to train new human rights defenders, to cooperate with each other, to achieve more massive scale of our actions, and to watchdog state activities with different transparency methods. I would like here especially to appreciate our mutual learning exercise. Just look at the growth of monitoring programs and strategic litigation. I remember well that when I started my work in 2004 and 2004-05 in the Helsinki Foundation, in fact, I copied the practice of amicus curiae from the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee. Now I see that there are so many organizations active in front of the European Court of Human Rights. Another tool that we have learned over years is access to public information. Moreover, thanks to knowledge on Hungarian illiberal changes, I could better respond to threats in Poland. Now, our role is to exchange our experiences regarding fight against authoritarian challenges. We should also learn from each other how to tackle climate change with the use of litigation techniques. Please note that our role is subsidiary in a society. Whatever we do, we cannot replace the whole political, economic, and international process in order to advance democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We can do a lot in order to inspire people, but there are certain processes we do not have enough of impact. Looking from this perspective, although times have changed, let us appreciate what we have achieved over the last 30 years. When we look back, we see that our experiences and civil society structure could be still used to help people. We have also capacity to respond to new threats and divisions in our societies. Let us continue to be masters in our basic function as guardians of human rights. Thank you very much.
And for showing us the way forward from your perspective and from your experience. We have time for a few questions, so if you have any, please share them via Facebook or via Q&A function of Zoom. Meantime, we have one question for you, Adam. As an ombudsman, did you cooperate with the defenders' offices, ombudsperson's offices in Armenia, Ukraine, and Georgia? And do you think that they face similar challenges? And that question that we have, I will ask this question too, I think. Grassroots, large-scale awareness raising and organizing are an essential element of keeping up human rights work. That's a comment from Harry Hummel.
Thank you very much for those questions and comments. Good to see you, Harry, here. Answering the question concerning cooperation, of course, we had a very good cooperation, especially with the Ombudsman of Ukraine and Ombudsman of Georgia. Please note that there is a quite important structure that support ombudsman institutions throughout the world. One structure is the International Ombudsman Institution. There is another structure which is called European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. Also, the OSCE, especially the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, has quite important role in making those contacts. Please note that with respect to Ombudsman of Ukraine, my major cooperation was about, in fact, fighting for rights of Ukrainian workers in Poland, because unfortunately, there is a massive migration from Ukraine to Poland, and there is, in my opinion, too much of hate speech and hate violence. So quite often I reacted to those cases, and I try also to respond to those to shape my policies as the ombudsman in order to provide as much support as possible to people of Ukraine. There were also different extradition cases instigated by Russia, in fact, and basically I was quite active in resisting those cases, because those cases were in fact directed against Ukrainian citizens, and in some of those cases I was quite successful. With respect to Georgia, this cooperation, I think, was more based on the mutual exchange of arguments and experiences. I know that Nino she's very engaged into amicus curiae practice in front of the European Court of Human Rights. In fact, I had always like a pending invitation to come to Tbilisi to visit the office, but somehow I did not manage to do it over my time as the ombudsman. I heard that recently the ombudsman of Georgia was also quite heavily targeted for some of the statements and interventions, and I think what is important in all of this is that this cooperation between our institutions is giving a lot of credit for, I would say, survival of the independence of the institution. So somehow, and here I would like to come back to one of the points I've made. I said about this tackling with number of different rights that are maybe not so much progressive, but they are basically about respecting some basic rights and freedoms, because you have all the time to prove that you are having legitimacy to the people. And because of the fact that I was dealing with a number of different cases not only just civil and political rights, but also different social rights, I could, let's say, diversify the risk of dealing with some strategic and politically sensitive cases. And it was, I think, crucial for me to survive until the end of my term, although there were a number of attempts to pressure towards me. Unfortunately, the new ombudsman is a person who is independent, and despite all those crisis situations, we still have the independent ombudsman institution.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Adam. Good to have you today. Now I give the floor to the moderator of the panel, to Natalia Antelava.
Thank you very much, Kety. Thank you. And of course, typically I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Adam, first of all, for that, for the fascinating keynote and some great insights, which I think will be great to kicking off our discussions. But before we start, I would like to introduce our panelists today. So it's quite a large panel, so hopefully we'll have enough time to get everyone's opinions in and also get your questions too. So keep them coming, please. So first, starting with Olga Skrypnyk is the head of the Crimean Human Rights Group. It's a member of NGO of Human Rights House Crimea, operating in exile from Kiev. Olga's organization monitors and documents human rights violations in Crimea daily, with a focus on the prohibition of torture, release of political prisoners, and an end to militarization. We also have Baia Pataraia from Georgia. She's the director of NGO Sapari. She's a member of Human Rights House Tbilisi. Sapari is a member of Human Rights House Tbilisi. And Sapari focuses on women's rights and supports victims of all sorts of violence, from domestic to sexual, economic, and so on. Baia is one of the leaders of the feminist movement in Georgia. And as a Georgian, I can confirm that she's an absolute legend. Arpy Manusyan is a researcher and the president of Socioscope, which is a member NGO of Human Rights House in Yerevan. Socioscope focuses on societal research about civil society processes, sexuality, the culture of democracy, and nationalism. We also have Oleksandra Matviychuk, who leads the Center for Civil Liberties based in Kiev. And Alexandra's organization exercises public control over law enforcement agencies and the judiciary and conducts trainings. Alexandra is one of the coordinators of Euromaidan SOS initiative and one of the initiators of Save Olex and Solve Global Action. Probably for the outsiders, one of the most spectacular shows of human rights in action in recent years. And last but not least, we have Rostislav Valvoda, who is the founder and executive director of Prague Civil Society Center. Rostislav has a decade of experience working in human rights across Russia, Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus. And he is one of the founders of the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. And I'm going to pick on him first. Rosti, I'll come to you with question first, but please, if you want to jump in, other panelists do, let's make it. And especially if you disagree, because we want to make it a discussion. So as Adam outlined so well in his talk just now, there are plenty of challenges that human rights defenders face today, you know, from populist politicians to technology to the public's short attention spans and general crisis of values, quite similar to the world that I come from, which is journalism. But I think for our discussion, Rosti, what I would really love to ask you is for you to hold up a mirror to the human rights community itself. And what do you think is the biggest challenge from within that the human rights defenders face, and the biggest obstacle to the success of their work? What is it that you guys need to be doing better to protect our societies?
Thanks for having me, and thanks for this challenging question. In fact, I see you try to make it very interesting, the debate very interesting right from the start. I will say one point, I think, and that may come sort of a little bit, or I may come as a come across as respectful, disagreeing with some of the points raised by Professor Bodnar. I think that the biggest challenge we face today from the external sort of side in this part of the world is really this vision and work being done on the resurgence of the Soviet Union. And that is a real vision, that is a kind of real effort being made, and quite successfully in the past years, driven from the Kremlin. And it's unfortunate that the real threat to the very existence of countries we mentioned these 3 countries. The question is whether these countries will be able to survive this decade as independent whole countries. That's the very kind of real threat. Now, in the face of this threat, you asked about the internal, so I'll try to answer that question. I think that over the years, in a way, the human rights community may have become too legalistic and too focused on international human rights law mechanisms that, in my view, are not effective to challenge the type of threat that we face. And I think they have, in a way, or the human rights community, in a way, lost, sort of went too far from the original source of inspiration, and the original source of inspiration was actually the dissident movement in the 70s and 80s. And that was actually a very political statement. The fact that a bunch of people who were, under all the existing rules at the time, who had no right to say anything, they said, hey guys, on power, you sign up for something and you're just not fulfilling it, and we're gonna call you on that. And that was kind of inherently and fundamentally political statement. They were not monitoring some complicated international mechanisms and producing lengthy reports, etc. They just said this very publicly, and they faced really harsh sentences for this. And I find that actually incredibly smart and courageous. And I think that we need some of this kind of bigger thinking and this is where I would respectfully disagree with Professor Bodnar, that I think we need to sort of broaden the scope of responsibility. We need to think about these bigger challenges to our countries, and we need to think about what civil society with this kind of civic power, which I think is huge, civic symbolic power in a way, can do. And I would say, frankly, that these days where you can actually, when you can win, because it's we need to win the struggle actually, where we can really win, I think the issue is corruption. What was human rights in 70s and 80s, I think is these days corruption, because all these guys, all these crooks on power, from Kremlin to Minsk and elsewhere, they try to pander as and pose as statesmen, as kind of having these big visions, but in fact they're just little crooks on power, and they like to keep their money in the West while talking about how evil it is. And I think this is
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think it sets us nicely. I mean, to be honest, I'm debating whether to go to Arpy next or maybe to Olga. It's very true. Adam, talked about sort of these human rights, these ideals of human rights that were created by the generation that still remembers communist times, and is so much of the structures of the human rights, sort of modern human rights organizations was built around that, was based on that memory. Arpy, Armenia is so interesting in the way, home to the latest successful revolution where people stood up and used actually technology in a positive way, and so on. And yet, do you what Rosti talked about, almost like a crisis of imagination, right? Like, what's next? What is it? Like, for the people who no longer remember the suppression of communism, what is that next battle? Like, how do you get people fired up about the young people fired up, and how do you get them to pay attention to the values that you are trying to promote?
Thank you for your question, Natalia, and I very much agree with Rostislav's points. Yes, in 2018, we went through this Velvet Revolution that was this people's struggle, and we used technologies as a great tool for people's struggle, for their political struggle. But afterwards, we had war, and we had COVID crisis, and then we had war. And now I think that we are in kind of stagnation, meaning civil society in Armenia, and this willingness to fight for human rights, for advancing democracy, etc. So we are kind of, I would maybe sound a bit depressive, but we are in a kind of depressive stage in Armenia within civil society. But also I would like to mention that we had like snap elections after the war, and it was very democratic, etc. So there is this common understanding that democracy is good, even there are many risks and attacks coming also from Russia and other, let's say, far-right and nationalistic groups in Armenia. There is this common belief that we need to go towards this democratic path. But what we lack now, I think, is to kind of rethink what we have done as a civil society throughout these years, what kind of social movements we had, and what can we do now. Because I think that now is we are in a way in this self-reflection mode and in a mode of rethinking. And I think that one way that like we need some kind of new grassroots, really grassroots, not NGOification and not institutionalized ways of fighting against far right group, etc. I'm not sure where this grassroots will come, but there are some seeds, there are some groups, people still fighting on environmental issues, on other social issues, on human rights. And I think that we as like more institutionalized NGOs or human rights community can only support these kind of groups, but not in a way patronize them or co-opt, because their mechanisms of struggle can be more radical. They question power structures more, I think, radically than some of human rights NGOs and let's say structured civil society organizations in our country.
Yeah. So it seems like we have a consensus between the two of you that there is a little bit of a crisis where, you know, the human rights community is slightly lagging behind and the agenda is being set by someone else. And there is a real need to reimagine how the pushing forward that human rights agenda can work. Baia, do you agree with that idea that the grassroots is what's needed, or is and how in this today's reality where, you know, for so many people, I mean, let's face it, the word NGO has become a dirty word, you know, like how do people who work for NGOs overcome that narrative, and what is that new narrative that can be created?
Mm-hmm. First of all, we have to understand that the NGO became like nasty word, not on its own, but because of the propaganda, which is very much upheld and even financed from Kremlin through these right-wing groups, extremist groups, and they are actually doing a very good job, unfortunately, in this direction. And on the other hand, human rights defenders now have to reclaim their status and their role within society. And it's not easy to fight back to this propaganda. And it's not word against word, but you have to put action against word. And to have this action and to be this action prized, it's important to have very close connection with the people, I would say. So grassroots movements is one of solutions, but on the other hand, what NGOs should do is that the society has to have a feeling that NGOs represent them, and the NGOs themselves have to have a feeling that they're working on exactly on those issues, which is very important and relevant for the general public. And here, as I see and as I observe, is that social and economic problems are very big problems, at least in Georgia and in those countries where poverty is a big issue, while more NGOs and more human rights defenders are focusing on political and civil rights. And here we see some differences between these two. And I think that the best answer to this, all the smear campaigns against human rights defenders and NGOs would be very close links and actions to the public, that the public understand that the NGOs are doing the work they actually are in need of.
Oleksandra, I want to come to you now. Thank you, Baia. I want to come to you first to, reflect, obviously, feel free to, on everything that your fellow panelists have said. But also Ukraine is like a very interesting example of an incredible grassroots movement since the beginning of the conflict in 2014. I mean, I've covered the war in Ukraine and visited a lot over the years, and you could see a society that was changing and transforming in front of your eyes. And definitely kind of it seemed like that civil awakening was affecting everyone. So in some ways, that grassroots element that everyone else has talked about seems, from the outside at least, very much present in Ukraine. Do you agree with that? And is that helpful, or what with that in place, like what's working for you guys and what's not?
I live in Ukraine, and the country has taken a significant step forward towards democratization, to the large extent because 8 years ago, it chose a path of European integration with its human rights standards. And the defense of this choice requires the participation of the entire civil society and the mass citizenship engagement, which we observed during the Revolution of Dignity and see now in countering the armed aggression from Russia. The lessons which are still learning are relevant for the entire region. First, I agree with my colleagues, it's necessary to work with society and its values, because human rights are more about a way of thinking. Therefore, it's not enough to adopt correct laws. Society values are still stronger. There are many examples when a society seems to accept some ideas, but they don't change the settings of the social character. And in critical moment, people are unable to act in accordance with the values they are declared. This means that even if the ideas of human rights were very widespread, which is not observed in many countries of our region, the question still remains how deeply these values were assimilated by society. And second, we need to build and to defend democratic institutions. Institutions matters. No revolution automatically creates institutions. After Revolution of Dignity, we realized that simply set new tasks for ourselves: how to create a fair and impartial judiciary, elaborate procedures for the authorities' accountability, protection of freedom of the press, peaceful assemblies, and other rights and freedom. Whether the rules of the game in the country will change or not depends not on how many people took to the Maidan at one time, but on whether society will take advantage of the open window of opportunity or not. So this is important.
Thank you. But I also want to, and I think in many ways Ukraine is a very worrying. The situation is extremely worrying, but it's also somewhat optimistic and a hopeful example. But at the same time, in the last 2 years, and there are others, Armenia was to an extent a couple of years ago. Moldova, unfortunately, we don't have anyone from Moldova here today, but Moldova is a hopeful example. But we also have so many opposites of that in the region. What we're seeing is that we're not even talking about the building democratic institutions, it's obliteration of any sort of democratic institutions and structures that existed. Tbilisi is full of Belarusian human rights defenders who are fleeing their country. The Russians are trying to find their new home. And more people are having to work from exile, and probably no one knows more about that than Olga. Olga, you are trying to defend human rights in Crimea while not being able to be in Crimea. What are the lessons that you've learned in the last years of doing your work that could be applicable for the rest of us, for the rest of your colleagues?
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, colleagues. Yes, I'm from Crimea, and before occupation, I lived in Crimea, in small town Yalta. And before I was human rights defender, but I worked with human rights education with my colleagues. After 2014, I need to move to Kyiv, but we continue our work and created human rights organizations that documents human rights violations and war crimes since 2014. Our team is human rights defenders and human rights journalists from Crimea. All of us are IDPs, and I think it's very important for us because we understand many problems of Ukrainians who are victims of armed conflict from Donbass or from Crimea. And I think many important that I see for me that Ukrainian organizations have important and high-level experience in documenting human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity in the context of armed conflict. And it's important that we started this immediately after the start of the conflict. We have time for this, I think. Even even then, Ukraine was not ready for document human rights violations. Ukrainian civil society did it. Also, I think for us important that we use many instruments for investigations and very important instruments like European Court for Human Rights, International Criminal Court, and other. So, and now one more result of work human rights defenders and human rights organizations who work with armed conflict. First of all, it's cooperate with Ukrainian state authorities for effective investigation of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Of course, we have many issues in this sphere, but I think very good result. It's like Department of War. This department was created in Office of General Prosecutor in Ukraine. It's a result of cooperation between human rights defenders and Ukrainian prosecutor office. First of all, I mean Office of Crimean Prosecutor. Like example of this cooperates, it's at least 20 submissions were sent to International Criminal Court about war crimes and human rights and gross human rights violations in Crimea since 2014. But one more, I think, for Ukrainian civil society, very important to keep closely relations with people who stay in occupied territories. Because for us, it's like fundament of our work. We work with grassroots initiatives in Crimea, first of all, like Crimean Solidarity or Ukrainian journalists or Crimean human rights defenders, Crimean Tatar activists. Unfortunately, these people work in very different difficult conditions, because on the one hand, civil society acts under conditions of persecution, but on other hand, these repressions make people fight future unity and find a new form of solidarity. And many years we can cooperate with Crimeans who stay in Peninsula and continue our human rights work. I think it's, for me, it's very important.
So yeah, the importance of for the Ukrainian civil rights and human rights activists to stay in touch with those who are still locked in the other universe. It actually, Olga, you also really made very good points about the importance of collaboration, which leads nicely into a question that we have in the chat from Lisa Henry, who says, appreciating the necessary and creative collaboration between NGOs and human rights activists, the street opposition, how can we enhance reporting and monitoring of human rights abuses, torture during protests? And where can we go with that data? What can we get out of it? And how do we ensure survivors get the psychological support they have a right to if they're harassed, imprisoned, and beaten? So I imagine this varies from country to country, but I don't know who. It looks like Oleksandra wants to take that question. Oleksandra, do you want to answer the question?
Yes, I would like to present our experience, because the situation in different countries are unique, and there is no like single recipe, but maybe their experience of the initiative Euromaidan SOS will be useful. When the Revolution of Dignity started and millions of people took part in the protest movement or supporting the protest movements, we, together with colleagues, created an initiative Euromaidan SOS. And we brought up several thousands of ordinary people to join to this initiative. During the whole months of protest, we work 24 hours a day and provide legal and other aid to persecuted protesters. And someday hundreds and hundreds of people who were arrested, beaten, tortured, injured, accused in fabricated criminal or administrative charges passed through our care. And we, at the end of the Revolution of Dignity, was able to proceed more than 16,000 requests for assistance only because the ordinary people supported the work of human rights defender. And then later, it's depend on the way of transitional period. We analyze all our database and send several submissions to International Criminal Court, to the Special Advisor Panel, which was created by Council of Europe. We provide all our materials to the national investigative bodies and still try to provide public oversight how the investigation is going on.
Yeah, thank you for that. The next, if anyone wants to jump in with their examples of what they've done, reflecting on that question, please raise your hand. Yes, Olga, please.
Thank you. Very briefly, I agree with Oleksandra, and we have maybe a very close experience because Oleksandra worked with war crimes too. And sorry, one moment. I said about our experience, like International Criminal Court or another court instruments. I think our experience is like 3 levels of work. First, international level, when we appeal to different human rights international organizations like UN level, OSCE, and other International Criminal Court and other court instruments. Next, it's the national level, and of course, it's first of all work with national state authorities like prosecutors or police. And one more important level, it's like level of large-scale informing of society in Ukraine. For us, was very important to inform Ukrainian society what happened in Crimea, why these actions are war crimes, why this action by Russian Federation in Crimea it's about war crimes, about human rights violations. And during these 8 years, we also, and we continue work with informing our society about this, about situation in Crimea, because very important that our society know about it, because sometimes only human rights defender knows that it's human rights violation or it's or war crime, but our society don't know it. So I think very important level work with our society, with media, with different organizations and not human rights organizations, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another excellent question. Excellent, because I was going to ask that question. And Rosti, I was going to ask you this question. You mentioned that corruption is sort of the new, it can become like the new things for people to rally about, that new force that people can confront. So we have a question in the chat. How do you think the civil society can tackle the idea that the population is aware that the governing elites are corrupt, but there is so-called social contract? Yes, we know that they steal a lot, but they provide services, build roads, and so on. So we'll just put up with it. Basically, the question says, everyone is aware of corruption, and the examples of Navalny's team's investigations, which did not shake the regime as such, just solidified them in some way. Over to you, Rostislav.
Yes, thanks. Good question indeed. I saw it in the chat and wanted to respond to that anyway. I just think it's the idea is wrong in a way. Like the idea that the authorities don't care about all these investigations and all those people who expose their corrupted nature is somehow they don't care. I mean, it's just plain wrong. I mean, and you don't have to trust me. Look at what they're doing. Why would you have Roskomnadzor, Russia's censorship agency, sending letters to individual media now with the request to remove any mention of this Putin Palace investigation if they didn't mind? You know, in fact, the idea that somehow there is an investigation, it will shake the whole society and the regime will somehow be toppled, I think it's just not realistic. That's not how things work. But this long-term anti-corruption work that actually really uncovers and sensitizes society to the injustice that the regimes, by being so corrupt, create. This is what they are very sensitive about. And do they really deliver? The regimes, do they really are they able to bring to people what they request for them? I don't think so. So in a way, this is a very effective model. And if you ask me what's the most successful human rights advocacy or human rights campaign of the past decade, I'll say Bill Browder, frankly. And Bill Browder, who has actually managed to pass a law that's is completely outside the international law, international human rights mechanisms, etc. All of these kind of very legalistic approaches. It's very political, but it's what actually really changes the game. It really kind of hits the abusers in where it is sensitive to them, that is in this money abroad and their access to abroad and the access of their families to abroad, because they like to have their mistresses and kids in school in British schools, but talk about conservative values and kind of national idea. So I think we just need to have these mechanisms that somehow cut this model of steal at home, spend abroad. We need to cut this model, and sanctions are actually one of the ways. And here's I think an opening for the human rights movement, and that is indeed the sanctions. Human rights activists are very good in doing meticulous, precise research, and I think what we need is that when these regimes really do something outrageous, like bringing down plane in Belarus, or threatening an invasion or doing an actual invasion, there is an appetite in the West to actually really crack down on some of these authoritarian practices, and we do not have this proofs and this research being done on who to put on the sanction lists. And I think we just need to do more of this. We need to know, where does Belarusian elite have their money? we need to document better, actually, how is it that the oligarchs that are close to Putin are in fact his wallets, so that you could actually win this argument in court in the West. So I think we need to do a lot of more of this prep work for these situations that will simply be happening because we are living in war times. They want the war, they create the war, and there's unfortunately little to stop it from happening. We just need to make sure that we don't lose our values on the way.
That's interesting, but it also, highlights kind of the reliance on Western institutions to do something about it, because that's where the courts are, where you can take them to court. Except, when it comes to the oligarchs and big money, there is still, there seems to be a little bit more of an awakening and awareness of the depth of the problem that it creates. But there is still massive resistance to it. And what can your community be doing to overcome that resistance? Like, how do you like wake the West up?
Yeah, so I agree. This is the reliance, or sort of on the Western institutions. I do think it is effective, exactly because this is where they have the money and this is where they have their families, etc., and want to keep the access there. But I do think that if you had Lavrov's daughter actually complaining at home that she no longer has the mansion in central London, you might have a change in tone and behavior in some of these elites. So that's one part.
So what is it that you need to be putting pressure on your governments, basically?
I think what human rights defenders and researchers, investigators in places like Russia, for instance, and Belarus can do is really to do this work of showing and doing the research of where these crooks from these societies, the corrupt elites, actually have their interests in the West, and really prove it, so that the Western institutions can then use it. That's just one part of the strategy. The other part of the strategy, of course, I think, and I very much agree here with what's been said about the, not going to the NGO professional model, but rather community building and organizing on the local level around local issues, and basically in a very informal way. That's another thing that you need to focus on, and you need to do that at home. And there is actually this work being done, even in Belarus today, even in Russia today. There is even if the risks are really huge in these places to do this work, people are ready to do this, and this needs to be done over the long term. It will take time. That's clear. But to me, it's not either or. You need to do both at the same time.
Okay, let's go to Arpy and then to Oleksandra. Arpy, please.
Yeah, thank you. I had just a small remark to what Rostislav has answered to the question. I think that sometimes, like these corrupted regimes, they also corrupt the agency of people, the agency of citizens. They claim that you cannot change anything, and in Armenia, and I think that in many post-socialist countries we experience that these regimes, they tell us that you are nothing, you cannot change anything, and we are the governors, and we will decide what to do. But I think also that there is a kind of there sometimes, like when it happened in Armenia in 2018, it like people are becoming like they are fed up. And there is this trigger and this feeling that, yes, we as a society now can change these corrupted regimes. And I think that civil society has a great role in these processes to show the agency of people, to help to build this struggle. So I just had this small remark to the question of why this social contract between society and, let's say, autocratic regimes can be.
Okay, Oleksandra, you had your hand up.
Ukrainians can say a lot about Russian influence and Russian interference, but I would like to stress to our own responsibility, because if you are on the bike, you have to pedal fast, otherwise you will fall. It should be noted that we were too wasteful about the time factor, and the situation has changed a lot. In our region, for several decades, Russia, as an heir to the Soviet Empire, was inert and didn't publicly demand revenge. One needs to understand that in the new reality, the Putin regime will not calmly observe the slow movement of the countries to the West. The Kremlin will actively fight for the influence in the region and, if necessary, use the war as a tool to achieve its goals. We have no time. We need to pedal this bike faster. And it's our also own responsibility. I would give you one example from Ukrainian practice. Police reform began in Ukraine a few years ago. One of the structural components of the national police, the patrol service, has been radically transformed. The police officers in the street, whom people had previously bypassed just in case, began to really fulfill and perform service functions. And society reacted with a huge leap in the confidence to the whole law enforcement system. But the reform didn't go beyond the patrol service, and the entire criminal executive block of the police remained unchanged. And people quickly figured out that this was a decoration, and the confidence to the democratic government as a whole began decreasing. So illiberal tendencies, external, internal, will be always present. The only question is whether they will be marginal or strong, that is rooted in society. And that's why democracy must demonstrate convincing success.
Thank you, Oleksandra. So Oleksandra just told us that we have no time, and living in the region, it's certainly, and seeing, in Georgia how quickly things have been deteriorating, it certainly often feels like we don't have time. But Rosti, you just said it's going to take time. So where does that leave us? Oleksandra, please.
It means that we have to understand that that our battle is a long marathon. It's not a sprint. And yes, a lot of changes needs a time, but we have to move faster. And in order to move faster, we have to push our government, who often try under the guise of reform, build scenery without going deep into solving problems. We have always remember that the ultimate measures of success is not donors, but populations. And the vector of movement is pointed by the active minority, but the speed of the movement is depend on passive majority. And that's why we need, as we started our conversation, to work with society and with society's values.
Baia, please jump in.
The problem is that some of our societies really have lost hope that it is possible to have a government which is not corrupted. And as, for example, in Georgia, as we see, there is a state capture, and most of the institutions now are in the hand of one oligarch. And even those institutions who try to be independent are completely demolished. Right? They start with the reform and they abolish independent institutions. So what can you do? So there's not much that you can do. And of course, human rights defenders are in the politics, if we understand this word in a broader meaning. But it's very important what opposition parties do. What are the alternatives to the ruling forces and ruling government, right? So, and sometimes people still feel that even if there will be a change in the government, the system will not be changed anyhow, and it brings a lot of frustration. So in this picture, what I see as a solution is that human rights defenders, activists, and human rights organizations should be very strict upon oppositional parties as well, in order to have the vision of opposition, how they are going to tackle the problem, whether they're ready to take some obligations before they are in power, in order to have some hopes that when there will be a shift of power in the government, this new political parties and new forces do not do the same whatever has been done by the previous government. So here I think that human rights defenders should be also focusing on criticism of the general political forces, not only in power, but also in opposition, and demanding from them like clear plans, clear visions, and some promises which will bring the hope into the society.
Thank you, Baia. And we have a question for you that actually ties into it, which you partially answered, but I want to both acknowledge the question and maybe you have something to add. So you mentioned one of our audience members says, you mentioned that human rights defenders need to take action against word. So, you know, do things rather than talk about it. And what kind of actions are you thinking of? So if you can be more specific.
First of all, there is always a lot of public inquiries what the public see as a problem. And then you can have what NGOs do, and then you can compare whether this is whether it's a coincidences or not, right? And for example, we see that people are bothered with poverty, for example, or with lack of jobs and lack of guarantees, etc. But we are focusing on maybe on some other issues. So in order to put action, I mean that we have to be doing something which there is a need from broader societies, that the community has that understanding that I am pushing and advocating and lobbying for the issue, which is important for the local community, that they see this, and also we have even more responsibilities, as I already mentioned, that we have to intervene into bigger politics and challenge not only the government, that we definitely have to do it, but also somehow put safeguards for future, for others who want to come into power, to somehow safeguard the future politics. And if the public sees that we can be not only reactive to the problems, but also proactive, and putting on the table the visions of the future and of the future solutions, I think that our renommé will somehow be improved, and we will regain what human rights defender status stands for.
Thank you. We have a question for Arpy, actually, that sort of slightly ties into that issue of trust, but in the context of Armenia, it has to do with Nagorno-Karabakh and the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. The question is basically, you know, NGOs in Armenia, the trust in NGOs in Armenia, how was it affected by the conflict, and what was the conflict's impact on the reputation of the NGOs in Armenia?
There is this heritage of distrust towards civil society and NGOs in general in Armenia. It's not affected only by war, but I would say that I haven't seen any research that there was like decline of distrust towards NGOs after the war. Rather, NGOs played a big role during the war in the context of providing humanitarian aid to people who were affected by the war, etc. So I think that there was more distrust towards, let's say, international organizations and international partners from like local NGOs were very much disappointed in terms of there was this feeling that our friends are silent, that they are not condemning the war in general, that they are not helping in to stop the war. And I think that now also we are in a kind of, there are these debates within Armenian civil society that internationals somehow failed their mission, their human rights mission during the war. And but I think that it's time to like get over this vicious cycle in terms of finding new ways of rebuilding relationships with internationals, our partners, our colleagues. And I think that what we can do as a civil society in Armenia, I think that we should push our like local and domestic agendas more radically than we did before, and somehow also be more critical towards ourselves and towards our international partners. And I think that,
Arpy, do you think that feeling of being let down that was there because of the war, and civil society activists in Armenia feeling that they've been let down by the international community, do you think that lingers on, or do you feel like, you know, you're on a path or you're moving away from it? I heard very clearly that you say it's time to move on, but that's just, you know, that's you. Do you think as a society Armenia is moving on, or will it have a lasting impact?
I think it had a huge impact. I'm not sure that we will overcome it, or we have already overcame this distrust towards internationals, this feeling of disappointment. But I think that we are on the way of it, on the way of rethinking the relationships, on the way of rebuilding new kinds of relationships with the internationals.
And, you know, I want to tie, there is another question that was actually for Arpy and Baia, but I think I would like to ask all of you this question. And Arpy, I would like to start with you because, you know, it's sort of like, it's a sequel to your answer just now. And what are the lessons learned from that? You know, what are the lessons learned? Anything that you would have done differently? You know, specifically in this situation, what are the lessons learned? And then I'll slightly rephrase the questions for the others.
I was thinking about that question for a long time, and I think that what we can do differently is maybe be more critical to this relationships or power dynamics between, let's say, donor organizations or international organizations and local organizations, and to be more proactive in shaping our own agendas, local agendas, to be more based on the grassroots, on the needs of our publics, because I think that a big portion of this trust that is coming from general society public towards NGOs is that we at some point failed this deep and direct and transparent communication between civil society and the society in general. And we were all in our bubbles somehow. We were working with our target groups and they are usually more marginalized groups, and we somehow failed to show the general public that the human rights issues of marginalized groups are also affecting the general in the society in general. So I think what we could do differently is to communicate better with the society and communicate better with internationals, to be more radical in shaping our own agendas, and to be more grassroots rather than this institutionalized. And I would answer that way.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Baia, is there anything you would have done differently?
Yes, I would like
when
to
it
add.
comes?
Somehow we are forgetting that these post-Soviet countries didn't have the correct understanding of human rights, and we don't have a consensus on the values. Sometimes we assume that we do have it, but we don't. For example, people don't understand the universality of human rights, that they don't understand the concept of genuine equality between people. between men and women and generally peoples, right? So, and therefore we had a very major problem with our society is that not having similar values. And therefore I think that what we have learned so far is that we have to work on changing mentality. Unfortunately, we still have in our countries mentality which does not respect universal human rights. But we have to make it, we have to do it not confronting society, but rather finding similarities with them, rather having the language which is understandable for them, rather finding those people who could work as mediums between maybe art and community. And who are those who should be talking for the first, as a first step, and then as a second step. So our basic problem, including even in relation with corruption, is lack of values, which has been deteriorated by Soviet era and Soviet mentality. We have to reclaim and we have to relearn the universality of human rights. And we have to actually invest in this because unfortunately, Ministry of Education is not doing much.
I'm going to ask others this question as well. Olga, what are the lessons learned? What would you have done differently in your efforts to promote human rights in the last years, given the current situation?
Thank you. I think it's not about that I do another. First of all, for me, I think the constant threat of war from Russia has taught us that only Ukrainians will fight for Ukraine anyway. It's mean that at the same time, we must also fight for democratic changes in our country because only Ukrainians can do it. For us, I think very important that Ukrainian human rights organizations work, first of all, for constantly keep in touch with local initiatives with people who are in occupation. It's in case of Ukraine. Also, it's very important to be very clear with donors because we know what we need. And I think we can and we must be clear with donors. Maybe it's very briefly opinion if we think about it.
Alexandra and then Rostislav. What lessons for you and what would you have done differently?
2 points to add to this conversation. First, lessons learned that we really live in a very interconnected world, and only spread over freedom make our world more safer. That's why we have to use international solidarity not like a good wording, but a real policy and transfer it into real action. We need to support each other because for years, Russian Human Rights Society and Russian human rights defenders are facing with different kinds of persecutions. And then when Kremlin ruined the trust between civil society and general public and elaborate a package of repressive laws made the space for civil society very narrow, etc., it started acted towards Ukraine and occupied Crimea and started a hybrid war in the Donbass. So it's our responsibility is what's going on in Russia with civil society as well. And now I will use this opportunity to call to the problems with memorials in Russia, because you know that December last year, the court decision prohibited activity of memorials. And this is not a culmination of the repression. It's a real sign of a new quality, of a new epoch. And second, to the end on the positive mood, it's not about what I will do differently, but it's a real lesson learned from my past experience. Because human rights defenders very often not work for human rights. They fight for human rights in very difficult conditions. And sometimes all our efforts can be seen like that there is no sense in them. But this history proves that we need to continue our fight for human rights, and the results can be unexpectedly be achieved. This is my own experience.
Rosti?
So perhaps a quick question, a quick answer to this would be that I wish we did more. We did support more of this kind of anti-corruption investigations and more of this anti-corruption efforts than we did. I mean, we do that, but I just feel that there would be need to have much more. And secondly, or sort of more longer answer to this question, and that's kind of a broader from this perspective of what this assistance or donor community can do or could do differently, because we are part of that, is that I think we just need to, in a way, take a sort of zoom out a little bit and take a bigger picture approach. I think for a long time, this whole idea of supporting positive changes in societies that are transitioning was just about focusing narrowly on civil society or human rights defenders, even as a smaller section of broad civil society. And I think we really just need to take a step back and take a broader approach and really think about actually not one sector, because civil society can't go it alone, but 3 sectors. And that is, apart from civil society that needs to be, continue to be supported, there needs to be a separate line of thinking and programming and support going to independent media, including, I mean, and this depends, context to context, but in some contexts where that are really unfree, it also means funding the media, not, training of trainers, but really fund actually journalists doing journalism, because it's hard and it's needed. Yes.
I'm going to argue with you about that. No,
yes.
Don't fund media.
Yes,
absolutely.
And thirdly, yes. And thirdly, I think there also needs to be work being done on working with political opposition, which is much more difficult, much more there is this line of legitimacy, or where do you put it? But I think it is legitimate field, and there was work being done. It's just the past 10-15 years, it's somehow completely was sidelined or pushed aside, and I think we need to restart that, and to end on a more or sort of to not to sound too gloomy, because I do not think it's actually gloomy midterm. Of course, there is this prospect of major war, which is incredibly serious and potentially terrible. But at the same time, what makes me really hopeful midterm is that all these authoritarians and all these basically corrupt little men clinging in power, aging on top, they can't really stop this underlying social change that causes these regimes to be insecure. I think Putin has a reason to feel insecure, but he's not insecure about Ukraine or NATO. He's insecure about Russians, because Russians are simply getting really discontent, and there is this sense of basically the prices are doubling, and all these social all these post crisis post-COVID issues that we have here, they have there, but 3 times worse, because the state doesn't give a damn about solving these issues. It's rather is busy bringing more troops to the Ukrainian border, and people are simply fed up more and more. And just the fact it's not seen because they pushed all the the remnants of independent media out of the country doesn't mean it's not there. And I think this underlying social change of basically Putin or Lukashenko offering, oh, I'm going to bring you back to the Soviet Union, is just not an interesting political offer to greater and greater parts of society. It's just people in their 30s, 35-year-olds, 40-year-olds, they don't give a damn. They want, normal services, normal roads, normal hospitals, normal kind of, economy. And they want to, Russians do not want to be in this pariah state wherever they go outside Russia, because everybody looks at them and are you crazy or what? So, you know, I think this
Rusty,
is what
let me jump in. Let me jump in for a second. You got to the hopeful part too early, so I'm going to divert it back. You know, to be honest, I've heard all of this 10 years ago, and I've heard all of it 15 years ago. Russians are fed up. It's all going to be over soon. This is not, you know, and people don't give a, you know, and you say like people don't give a damn, but isn't that part of the problem, that people don't give a damn? And they're also seeing examples of economic successes with very limited freedom. The social media seems to have, you know, like take China. There are lots of people around the world that who actually admire China's model. There are plenty of Russians who came out for Navalny and for the you know, all the revelations, but the majority didn't. And social media seems to have just opened just enough of a vent to let the tensions air out without bringing people out onto the streets. So apathy and short attention spans seem to be, you know, a really big phenomena of this century, arguably much more so than before. And what do you do with that? So you say, okay, you know, the people are the authoritarians are hit them where it hurts, which is money, and that's what they care about. And I agree, that's what they care about. But they will only care about it if their electorate cares about it, or if their not electorate in this case, if their constituency care about it. And to make them care, I agree, support independent media, because they are, you know, in part they play an important role in making people care, although they too are very lost in how to grab that attention that is in such deficit. So what do you do? So I'm, you know, playing devil's advocate here, much as I would like to, you know, agree with you about being hopeful. There is plenty of reason not to be hopeful, and to me that apathy and lack of attention spans is one of them. You know, not giving a damn both ways is a big part of it. So what do you guys do about that? Like, how do you counter that? And please, just whoever wants to go first, Rosti, carry on, but if others want to jump in, I hope that others will jump in.
Shall
Rosti,
I
go for
is
it?
Is there, okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right. I think I agree with all those points. Of course, all these trends are there. But then I would say, look, with all these trends and all this kind of against all the odds, you know, we have seen the revolution in Armenia. We have seen the revolution in Belarus, which was completely, you know, it was completely unexpected. We did not really, nobody really saw that coming. And, you know, if it wasn't for the support from Moscow, Lukashenko would not be there now. Like he would not be, he only held up through the support to the security apparatus and guarantees from Moscow. So what I'm trying to say, there is this kind of underlying social change, this kind of historic process. And yes, it is, and sort of society wants, you know, craves more, better services, more accountable governments, more justice. They see that, you know, the regimes as unjust. But you know, it's all these are really historic processes. So when is it enough? You know, for instance, what happened in Belarus last year, if it happened 10 years ago, would it mean that Lukashenko would be gone? Probably yes, because the context was different and Kremlin was, you know, much less ready to actually intervene the way they did in this case. So same question about, you know, what would happen in Kazakhstan if there wasn't kind of this you know, troops being brought immediately to prop up Tokayev. So and if somebody did not, you know, did not systematically bring in violence into what was essentially or originally a peaceful protest. So yes, these are challenges, these are fights, but you know, history doesn't happen without fights. So we just need to think, we just need to organize, we just need to sort of vision and build trust of society and hope that in the long term we win.
Oleksandra, please, and then Arpy.
Several comments to this very difficult question. I wish I knew the simple answer, but I don't knew. I think that you are totally right. And before, it was a clear link that if you have democracy, it will lead to economical development. And now we have different examples when autocracy can lead to economical development. And I think that this is a reason why even global institutions starting to lose interest to human rights. They are mostly focused on how to fight with corruption, which for sure it's important, but not how to promote human rights and freedom around the world. And this is a real problem. And we couldn't tackle this problem with rational arguments, because you can show a lot of examples, historical examples, current individual cases, that it's very dangerous to live in wealth but authoritarian model of society, but people will always think that it's never touched them personally, and this is about somebody else but not about them, as it's not their story. And that's why I think that we have, as a human rights society around the world, to restore the human rights enlightenment campaign. I mean, we need to restore the Helsinki movement. We need to start enlightenment campaign like make human rights great again, or something like this. Because for my point of view, we now in historical civilization battle, and this is a battle for values, and this is a battle which need all active people to join to it. But I see that a lot of societies don't want to go from the comfort zone and step in this civilization battle, and we need their efforts.
Arpy, please jump in. Thank you, Oleksandra.
Thank you, and I would be very short, just a very small remark. I think that we can view also these turbulent and very difficult times as a like critical juncture, or something like window of opportunity to act differently. I think that we need to act differently, both on policy level, on activist level, on grassroots level, and also on the level of communicating with the general public. And I think that sometimes we need to go off from social media, like from Facebook, etc., because like in Armenia after the war, it's like a mess. Like when you are in Facebook, you think that everything is bad and there is nothing hopeful, and you can't do anything, you can't change anything. So sometimes you just need to cut these kind of things, these social media, online things, and go to the grassroots, go and just do the job, do what you need, do what you think that is important. And I think that there can be also hope without optimism. Like you can act without thinking that there can be a big change in near future, but there can be change in more general perspective. So I think that we can just act differently, do what we think is important to communicate better with the public, and it's okay to be not that much optimistic, but still hopeful.
Thank you, Arpy. And Adam has joined us again because he has an intervention. Adam, please, we're keen to hear from you.
Hi, I was for the whole time, but simply it was a panel, so I thought that it is the discussion between panelists. But let me just answer some of your points, maybe, because we are talking in a company of people who are, in my opinion at least, under daily stress, over occupation with cases, with daily problems, with flood of issues coming on a daily basis. And I know this reality because this is these are my days also, even right now when I'm not any longer as the ombudsman. I'm just right now as an academic teacher and as a commentator. But I would like to underline once again, maybe it is too strong word on my side, but I think over all those years I have learned that we shouldn't take too much of the responsibility for the whole world. We do not have impact on what Mr. Putin will do in upcoming days. We do not have impact on the relationship between Russia and Germany, France, United States and China. We do not have impact, how the big tech companies will evolve and what could be the algorithm of polarization inserted in a given moment to spur the debate. Simply, we do not have impact on the recession in economies, on different particular, mistakes, cheats, or other things that are committed by our rulers. And of course, we would like to have impact on all of this. Of course, we would like to change the world around us. We would like to steer our societies in a better direction.
Professor Bodnar, so what do you have an impact on if you don't have it on any of the things that you listed?
So just please let me tell it to you, okay? I will just finish, okay? My point is simply that if we take on ourselves too much of a responsibility, then the frustration appears, and then the dissatisfaction appears with our work. Simply my role, as I was instructed, was to say that if we look back into last 30 years of the developments in the civil society sector in our countries, we see how huge development we did. What is our role as guardians of human rights? How the civil society looks differently as it looked in 1992, 89, or whatever date we'll approach. How many generations of human rights defenders we have instructed? How many of them contributed to the real change in our societies? And I think that if we look from this perspective of back years, we see that there is a hope simply for the future, that all of this will contribute. And simply we have impact on delivery of justice on a daily basis. We have impact on helping people. We have impact on changing attitudes, on strengthening courts, on strengthening institutions, on strengthening the supranational institutions. And maybe sometimes our impact is not so huge as we would like to, but I think we should appreciate still the change we are achieving. So that was my message. So let us have hope that within limits of our competences, resources, we can do still quite a lot. Thank you.
Don't get too demoralized, basically, is the message. I guess the panel was getting too demoralizing, but I thought that the sort of figuring out what the direction is an important part of it. We do have one question. We still have time, but starting to run out. Still have 15 minutes, but we do have one question in the chat, and please send more questions. We still have the opportunity for a few more. The question I think I would like to put to Baia first, but anyone else who would like to pick it up, please do. So the question is, trans rights defenders are usually attacked both on the online platform and physically. I'm interested about the steps that Human Rights House takes to prevent these cases. So if any of you can speak about that would be great.
Unfortunately, LGBTQI defenders are the defenders at most danger especially in Georgia, and as for trans people themselves and also trans defenders are, of course, under the biggest attack. What Human Rights Houses can do is that first, what they are already doing is providing like legal support, providing psychological support, like against burnout, to taking care of the trans human rights defenders and other human rights defenders. And on the other hand, media is also sometimes playing a very positive role while giving portraits of these people and their work, what they do, and how they act. And I think that slowly, step by step, indeed we are going forward. And what we can do also is to push for the police that they actually do their job and they investigate all these attacks and they punish people, because impunity is one of the also which is fueling all these kind of attacks. And
Baia, is it working? Are you seeing progress in Georgia on trans rights?
Yes, I think that there is a little bit, definitely there is more acceptance in the public, in the bigger society than it was before. And we also see more of those people who are trans human rights defenders on different TV shows and on media, and mostly their image is quite positive. And I think that this will bring us some results. Of course, this is one of the hardest part of the human rights work that LGBTQI defenders actually do, and they are at the greatest risk, at least in Georgia, and they are really one of the under danger. This is true, but we and there is no like very shortcut in this work. But I think that this consecutive work that we do, on the one hand, supporting these people and providing all kinds of help and guidance, and on the second hand, working with general public to make them more empathetic to these people, of course, is bringing some results.
Does anyone else want to pick up on the question for your respective countries? Thank you, Baia. I wanted then to pick up on what Professor Bodnar was saying, and sort of the impact and what human rights defenders have an ability to impact and what they don't. And I mean, it's interesting, and we don't want to get into the debate for me, who is an outsider and is not part of your profession and your, but is kind of adjacent to it. It's an interesting question, because I think impacting the conversation is about all of these things that you mentioned. Is really important. And I want to ask our panelists this question: how important, in the age of social media and in the age of this like information overload, how important is it for the human rights defenders and for civil society at large to, like, what role do you play in shaping the narrative? And are you doing, and if you see, I'm curious if you see that as part of your job, and if you do, then do you think you're doing a good enough of a job in this era of historic civilizational battle, as Oleksandra called it, for values? How do you shape the narrative in this battle for values? Anyone?
Well, I think Oleksandra is raising her hand. So
great, Oleksandra, please.
We have a Ukrainian proverb: you have to think globally and act locally. That's why I still think that if we want to reach something on our level, we have to to create a picture of more broader picture. So if I want to change situation in Ukraine, I need to understand how I can change situation or in region, or maybe it's better wording not how I can change, but how the change, how the region has to be changed in order to achieve results in Ukraine, because there are a lot of things which have no limitation in national border. And I strongly believe that freedom and human rights, it's such kind of things. And here I rely upon on dissidents movement, because when I read memories of dissident, I find very interesting memories which reflect me my own feeling. The dissident wrote that we have no hope. We are fighting against the whole state machine. It was USSR. We have no freedom of speech. We have no freedom of assembly. We couldn't open our banner in the Moscow square 30 seconds and we are arrested and then spent years and years in prisons. But even regard that we have no hope, we still continue our work, because it's about our choice and it's about our dignity, not to be indifferent to the dramatic events which going on. So I think that we have to dream about bigger impact, and we have to, as Adam said, work locally to achieve concrete results.
I would like to add with regard to the impacted narratives that we are creating. And as you know, I'm women rights defender, and definitely I can say that these social medias brought us some advances and some possibilities to find each other for all those activities from all those cities and villages around one country. And it created a possibility for us to unite and to create narrative, at least on social media. And as far as traditional media is very attentive towards social media, it's very it's much easier to get on traditional media via using social media nowadays. And definitely it was a lot, like, for example, 10 years ago, it was a big deal to have this opportunity. But now the situation has been changed a little bit, because these extremist groups, far-right wing groups, has and all this disinformation has become very powerful. So they somehow, after several years, they have catch up, and now they're using it this as a tool, as a weapon, and now it brings a lot of challenges. Also, like cyber attacks, cyberbullying has become a very serious problem. So on the one hand, it brought a lot of possibilities, but what we see nowadays is that there are a lot of threats that this social media now brings, because it's almost impossible to tackle the disinformation. It's very difficult to chase disinformation and somehow debunk it. And that's why there is now a lot of critiques towards Facebook or Instagram or many other social media, because it also turned out that it's also our weakest point at the same time. So today we have different challenges with social media than we had it like 10 years ago.
And this seems to be like a really good point to look ahead a little bit. Can we fast forward in our imagination, say, I don't know, 30 years? What do you think the challenges will be there? What kind of challenges? Oh, sorry, Arpy, please jump in, and then I'll ask that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone can think about 30 years from now.
Rostislav was speaking about the importance of independent media, but I would also like to highlight the importance of independent research that can help, that can inform in developing new narratives and discourses to show the general public the corrupt narratives, or false narratives that that affect our lives. So I think that I'm a researcher, but I think also that research community is very important in these turbulent times in developing new narratives, and or at least in helping, assisting to shape these narratives, and also to help civil society organizations with this independent research that they can use for their advocacy, for their lobby, etc. So funding researchers is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Point taken. So just looking ahead a little bit before we, well, not a little bit, 30 years, let's look ahead 30 years, totally arbitrary. It can be 10 or it can be 50. But where do you see the human rights as the field headed? You know, let's end on the hopeful note, and what makes you hopeful about it? Whoever wants to jump in. Oh, no. Does it mean nobody is hopeful?
No, I can start.
It was only Adam. Adam, you cheered everyone up, but it didn't up and didn't quite. Okay, everyone is. Okay, Adam, we'll start with you. If you could just, if everyone could keep it brief, and then we'll go to Oleksandra and Rosti.
Maybe I would just say a very general comment. Just referring to one of those references by Oleksandra concerning dissidents. I also like to read about dissidents and their stories. And recently I studied quite a lot about the issue of so-called technological chain. What I mean by technological chain, it means that let's say, Communist Party was accusing people, the prosecutor was acting on the behalf of the Communist Party, and then everything ended up with jailing people. That was at least my country in the 70s and in 80s. I think right now, due to the rise of the new technologies, we don't need that kind of procedures. I think the major threat to us and our work is the extensive use of new technologies that are almost controlling any aspect of our life. And I think it is becoming a very important restriction on the work of journalists, human rights defenders, civil society actors, because our moves could be predicted, and also the population could be steered with completely different mechanisms that we can even think about. And I think that that is basically the major threat in upcoming, maybe, I don't know whether 30 years, maybe 10 years, in all different countries, whether they are democratic, half authoritarian, is the use of the new technologies in order to control people's behavior, and in order to control our emotions, and in order to deliver a proper result for the effectiveness of the government that is in power at a given moment. So I see here as a major challenge and a threat to the also human rights movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Oleksandra, please.
I'm optimistic about future. It's my character. So it's not based on some rational arguments, but I don't see our future. It will not be easier, but still I hope that after 13 years, such kind of campaign which I launch or initiative which together with our team we founded will not be necessary. I hope.
Anyone else for the final words of wisdom? I guess not. Oh, go on.
I will just say that what I especially taking a perspective of women's rights and other marginalized groups' rights, what I see is that the human rights law is developing. It is gaining more content, it is gaining more ideas, and it is broadening, and even human rights institutions are becoming more sensitive towards various issues. Those violences which are now normalized and somehow are accepted, view of them is changing, and I see human rights in 30 years as really rights that really reflect all the needs that people have and which gives voices to the voiceless. So I see it as a more sensitive and more powerful.
Thank you. Olga? Olga, you're muted, but you have your hand raised.
Yes, yes. Maybe one more optimistic view. I think often human rights values remain within a close group, like human rights activists, some lawyers, experts, some people. But I really hope that these values will become the values of most people. And I agree, of course, with my colleagues, for example, with Oleksandra. It's very difficult work for us in future and our colleagues, but I hope on this.
Thank you so much. I think on that optimistic note, we are ready to wrap up, but I was taking some notes on some of the practical advice that all of you had for how to make that more optimistic future happen. So I'm going to sum up very, very quickly. Here are a few things that came up that you think the human rights community, human rights defenders community should be doing. I'll start with my favorite: support for independent media, funding the media, absolutely. Support independent research that can contribute to shaping new narratives. Have language that people speak and find medium that take you into communities that you're not reaching. Think globally, act locally. Be clear with donors about what you need to be achieving. Shape our own agendas. Show up in places that matter. Unite and collaborate. Very poignant from Oleksandra that what's going on in Russia is a collective responsibility. Get out of your bubbles. Follow the money, because that's where it hurts. And last but not least, it's a marathon and not a sprint. But cycle hard, because we're running out of time to make human rights great again. Thank you so very much and thank you to Kety and to your team for giving me the honor of moderating this panel. It was a really real pleasure meeting you all and really fascinating discussion.
Thanks a lot, Natalia. Brilliant job you've done today. Thanks to all the panelists and the speakers. It was very interesting to listen in. Thanks to all our guests who have attended for 2 hours of this event. We hope that it was inspiring to you. Thanks to the interpreter, Vadim, for the great work that he has done today. As you know, many have mentioned hope today, so I would like to end with that note maybe. As Václav Havel used to say, hope is not the joy that everything is going oh so well, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good. I wish you and to us to keep up this hope and keep up the good work we're doing. And we definitely have lots of path markers going forward on our journey further. Thanks to everyone. Have a good evening or a good afternoon, depending on where you are. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.